In this recording, we'll be taking a look at Sonata Allegro form, one of the most important forms in all of Western music. The big picture is that Sonata Allegro form is an elaboration of rounded binary form in that there is an introductory section, there's a departure from that, and then there's a return. And so in that sense, it's connected to rounded binary form. The sections in the Sonata Allegro form, the introductory section is called the exposition. Often there are two contrasting themes or theme groups presented. There might be a very active one and then a very lyric one. If it is a major key Sonata Allegro form, the first theme would be in the key of the tonic and the second key would be in the theme of the dominant. However, if it is a minor key Sonata Allegro form, the primary theme or the principal theme, the first theme would be in the minor tonic, but then the secondary theme would move to the key of the major median. So for instance, if we were in C minor, it would move to E flat major. If we were in C major, in a major key, it would move to G major. So we're going to use the term theme groups, though, although some people in referring to these themes will call them principal and secondary, primary or secondary theme. In the second section, where we move away from that introductory material, those two themes or theme groups, in Sonata Allegro form, it's a development rather than a movement to a second theme like in rounded binary. The development section is a chance for the composer to work out the potential that was inherent in those initial themes that were presented back in the exposition. It's often a chance to show off the composer's ability to manipulate those themes. So it's an economic approach in that there's not new material presented, but rather material based on previous stuff. So it's a recycling or a repurposing of that material. Tension, though, is increased because of all of the manipulations, and especially because there's usually further modulation to several different key areas, related key areas usually. But at the very end of all of this, usually the composer has moved to the dominant so that he's prepared to return to the introductory material. When the exposition material returns, it's called the recapitulation. And in classical period sonata form, the recapitulation was almost verbatim the same as the exposition. However, there's one important change, and that is that rather than the principal theme moving to another key area for the secondary theme, in the recapitulation, both theme groups would stay in the tonic key in order to strengthen the sense of resolution. Perhaps there'd also be a coda or a codetta or some kind of closing material. So here's the big graph, the exposition where the initial material is exposed to the audience, the two theme groups, and then a development section where those where kernels, the seeds that were planted in the exposition are then developed and their potential is worked out, movement to various keys, major and minor, so there's a lot of sense of tension or motion or excitement building. The end of the development winding up on a dominant so that we could then move to the recapitulation, the return of the opening material, a familiar sound, satisfying for the audience to hear that return. And that recapitulation is almost the same as the exposition, except that the second theme group, instead of modulating to either the dominant or the major median, it's going to stay in the tonic. So the composer has to do a little bit of re-engineering of the transition material between those two themes. So you can see it's a nice balance, A, B, A. You can sense that classical composers like this kind of symmetry, and the Sonata Allegro form does come from the classical period. Speaking of classical period, the idea of having a dramatic narrative where the principal theme could be thought of like the protagonist, and the secondary theme could be thought of like the antagonist, and then those two themes, maybe there's Batman and then the Joker is the secondary theme, and during the development they have their conflict, but there's some kind of a resolution and a return to our hero at the end. So there's a classical dramatic narrative. That's one reason why the Sonata Allegro form is associated with the classical period. Local and global tension and release in between phrases and themes, And even if this was part of a bigger piece, like say the Sonata Allegro movement is the first movement of a symphony, which by the way it is. In many classical period symphonies, the first movement is Sonata Allegro form. But then maybe the second movement would be a much simpler form, perhaps minuet and trio. So there's connections between sections in a movement, and there's connections between movements. And then all of the parts of the Sonata Allegro form have these transitions. So between the principal theme and the secondary theme, those two theme groups in the exposition, there'll be some kind of a linking or transition music. And then when we hear the exposition return at the end of the Sonata Allegro form as our recapitulation, there's that recurrence, and it's familiar to us. So there's a lot of drama going on. The particular Sonata Allegro form we're going to look at is actually not a symphony, a symphonic piece, but more a piano piece, the Sonata in D major, number 37, by Franz Joseph Haydn. Many people regard him as the father of Sonata Allegro form. This is going to be the first movement of his piano sonata, and it's a fast movement, and that's why it's often called Sonata Allegro form. This movement is indicated at Allegro con brio, with energy. It was written around 1780, published in 1780, but written shortly before that. And I think the first thing we need to do is actually just listen to it. Now, the exposition, I didn't mention this, often is a repeated section. So we're going to hear the exposition twice, then we're going to hear moving on to the development, then we're going to hear the recapitulation. This whole piece is only 103 measures, so even though it's going to be a little bit of dead air without me talking much, we're going to just listen to it. If you have a score, you can follow along. I have the measure numbers indicated. The exposition begins, goes up to 40, measure 40, and then you're going to hear it repeated. That's very common in classical Sonata Allegro form. So we'll hear those opening 40 measures twice. Then the development, building tension. It's not very long, just 20 measures. And then the recapitulation, just a little bit longer than the exposition. There's just a tiny bit of additional material in there. The thing to listen for would be how the second theme, the composer Haydn works it out so the second theme does not modulate. Anyway, here's the movement. Okay, so we're coming up on the close of the exposition. And now we go back to the beginning. Okay, and now moving to the development section. winding down and back to the opening material, the recapitulation. And there it is. So next I'd like to look a little bit closer at the components and break this down a little bit. For the purposes of this particular sonata, I'm going to use the term group rather than theme or theme group. You'll see why as we look at the particulars, but you can think of the first group as the principal theme or the primary theme and the second group as the secondary theme. They're not really contrasting so much in this piano piece. And then there's some closing material for the exposition, and I'm going to call that the closing group because another theme is introduced there, but just briefly and entirely as closing material. So you're going to notice that this is in the key of D major. So by the time we get to the end of the first theme group, you're going to see a dominant, and the second theme group is going to be in the key of the dominant, which means in the key of D major, this is sonata in D major, what's going to get us to that dominant is the introduction of the note G sharp. Right? In the key of D major we have two sharps, F sharp and C sharp, but if we want to suggest the key of the dominant, which is the key of A major, we're going to need to introduce that G sharp, so we'll watch for that to happen. Okay, let's take a look at this first theme group, the first 8 measures of the score we have on the screen here now. And you can see that it starts on a nice big strong D major chord. By the end of 4 measures it's moved to the dominant. It's like a half cadence. It is a half cadence. And then the second phrase, 4 more measures, starts on tonic and ends on tonic. So it's a parallel period. The antecedent phrase ends on a half cadence and the consequent phrase ends on a full cadence on D. Here it is. I also want to point out that in measures 3 and 4, Haydn introduces an idea of having the 6th scale degree go down to the 5th scale degree, go down to 4, and then 3. So if we're in D, da 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 da, 6 5 4 3, that becomes something he's going to use in developing this piece later on. So I just wanted to point that out. It's also in what would this be here? We're in treble clef, so the D up to that B would be a major 10th. Or you could think of them just as thirds, major thirds. But these descending thirds or major tenths, we'll listen and observe that Haydn exploits that. So something he's introduced early on, we're going to see again later on. Okay, after the first 8 measures, there's some transition material. We're going to get a sense of motion, and the motion is that we're actually heading towards the dominant. And in the classical period, especially a composer like Haydn or even Mozart, they really make it clear when they're at the end of this transition and we're ready to introduce the second theme. You're going to hear this yum, dum, da, dum on the dominant. That's going to be very, very clear. Let's look at it harmonically. It starts on D, it moves to A. There's that 6 5 4 3 again and again, at least twice in the middle of this. And let's listen to it. Okay, and some transitions to the secondary theme might have ended on an E major chord so that you could begin the next area in the key of A. This one ends on an A. I don't know if we want to call it an A major chord, but certainly the note A, yum, dum, da dum, very strong dominant feel. But it does set up the dominant. Okay, so we move into the second theme group, and I've divided that into two sections. We'll call them 2A and 2B. The first, measure 17 through 21, is 2A, and 22 to 34 is 2B. Notice that we're starting with C sharp and E here, and then A up here. So this is an A major chord in the key of D. It's the dominant. And notice that G sharp that occurs like a lower neighboring tone there. 2B reminds us so much of the first theme group, the yum dum 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 da dum da dum, only it just starts that way and then there's something different. But it's all part of this sort of second theme group that emphasizes the key of A, or tonicizes A. There's there outlined in blue is 2A, and in pink is 2B. Let's listen. Okay, and there's some ascending thirds, again connected in a way to the thirds we've heard used before. All right, then at the end of the exposition, or at the end of the second group, there's this really cool chord. The Neapolitan chord is its name, but it's really a flat 2 chord. So if we're in the key of A, we've moved to the key of the dominant, the key of A. This is a B flat major triad here. When it occurs in first inversion, in the figured bass, we'd say it's 6, right? A flat 2, 6, a Neapolitan 6. So that's where we get that 6 from Neapolitan 6. But anyway, it's a flat 2, colloquial, or sometimes called the Neapolitan chord, and in first inversion, so we label it 6. Also, there's some secondary leading tone here, diminished chord, this D sharp chord. The D sharp is a pointer to E, right? And E is the dominant in A. So we're going to go to E here. There's a cadential 6/4. The E is in the bass, but it's basically an A chord. Then this is an E triad here, a dominant chord, and then we land on A. So we've actually modulated now for sure to A. So listen for that striking sound of the flat 2 chord, the Neapolitan chord. And here it comes, right here. Okay. And that took us a little bit into the closing group. So starting around measure 35, I'm calling this a third theme in a sense, although it's very much connected to the descending thirds that we've heard before. And it sort of just winds down the section, so I'm calling it a closing group. You could just call it a codetta if you wanted. Here is that music, starting at measure 35, yum pum pum, dum dum dum, dum dum dum, dum dum dum, and then an embellishment of it, dagga dagga dum, dagga dagga dum, dum 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 dum, and then dagga 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 dum dum da dum. So really, all of it is closing material. Okay, so somebody else analyzing this piece might have just said that there was 2 themes, right? A principal and a secondary theme, or a first theme group and a second theme group. And they might have called this just simply the codetta. I've divided it up because it seemed like what's at the beginning of it is really a third theme. But honestly, that's getting into the point of semantics. It's not that important. This is all sort of closing material, but I just called it a closing group. Okay, so we've looked at that much of the piece, and let's go into the development. What we're going to hear in the development is some music from theme 1 for the first part of the development, then some exploitation of that descending thirds from the first theme group for the second part of the development. Then the third part of the development is going to be about sort of spending a little bit of time with that Neapolitan 6 chord, and then a a movement to the dominant. Sometimes that in music is called a retransition, when that dominant is presented, because it's basically there, that dominant is there to help catapult you or springboard you back into the tonic, which will be the recapitulation. So here's that part one, and again, listen to the music from the first theme. Notice that Haydn's reversed the process. He's put the yum dum 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 in the left hand, and the right hand has more of a chordal background material. Starts in the key of A, where we left off at the end of the exposition, but it's going to move around a little bit to the supertonic, dominant, tonic. Okay. All right, and in the second part, I really like these chain suspensions. It's a variation of the idea of descending thirds, only he uses a process called augmentation. He lengthens the amount of time it takes for the descending third to happen, and he offsets them so it sounds like a chain suspension, and the left hand is doing this really wicked 16th note flourish at the same time. Notice we're back in the key of D during this, but we're moving towards the key of B minor near the end of this area. And here it is. Dum, 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 dum. Okay. And in the third part of the development, we'll see these descending cascades of 16th notes that will recall the Neapolitan six. Now, notice we had moved to the key of the submediant, the key of B minor, and in the key of B minor, the flat 2 would be a C major chord, and here it is. There's our Neapolitan 6, a C major chord, and then a secondary dominant. But we eventually wind up back on a major dominant that gets us back to A. We want to hear this A. Here it is. We want to hear this A that springboards us back into the key of D. But it sounds like we're in B minor for a while here. Even after the Neapolitan 6, we have an E sharp, which points to F sharp, which is the dominant of B minor, and this is a tonic 6. Although I should have used a lowercase Roman numeral 1 there. My apologies. It's a minor tonic 6. And then this F major chord with a minor 7, it's a dominant 7 in the key of B. But when we get to here, the B that we get is actually a dominant of the supertonic in A. So Haydn gives us a B chord here, but he gives us a B chord with an A natural on top. So we're going to start to hear that like a dominant chord. And then here, we're going to hear that as if we were in the key of A, as if that was the supertonic B. So eventually, though, we get this A major chord with a G natural. So a series of dominant 7s actually. Here is a dominant 7, here is a dominant 7. It's the dominant 7 of E, and then here is a dominant 7, this A chord, which is the dominant 7 of D. You don't need to know all of that, but I just want to point out there's some neat harmonic stuff happening, and it's the development that stuff usually happens, that kind of a quick progressive harmonies. So anyway, let's listen to this, and especially for that Neapolitan chord, it'll be very striking when it happens. Right here. And back to the tonic. Okay, so there's a lot of fast-moving harmonies, tonal centers shifting quickly in the development. All right, so those are the three parts of the development, and you can see there's even a symmetry there. The first and the third are longer than the middle, just like in the whole movement, the first and the third are longer than the development itself. All right, and then the recapitulation, we're going to listen for that first theme group, the second theme group, and the closing, but especially take note that the second theme group will be in the key of D. There's going to be a transition music that makes us sound like we're going to the key of A, but we end up not doing it. So we'll pay attention to that. Here's the opening section. There's a little extension of that first theme group, but it is basically the same thing. Here's the extension. Then a long dominant pedal. Okay. And so the transition music in the first theme group does have that 6-5-4-3 descending scale feature, and it does end on A, dum dum da dum, just like the opening did. But instead of going to A, like the in the exposition, this is going to end up going to D. Dum da dum. So it's obvious we're done that first theme group, and now the second theme group begins in the key of D, and we've divided it again into theme 2A and theme 2B, which reminds us of the opening theme. That that happens here. Let's listen to that. Okay. And at the end of the second theme group, we have the Neapolitan 6 chord again. Now, remember that Neapolitan 6 chord in the key of A was a B flat chord. Here, it's actually still a B flat chord. It's kind of like the Neapolitan of the dominant. It actually isn't a 6 chord. Notice it's we're not using the number 6 because it's actually not in first inversion. It's in root position here. And we get a similar sounding secondary dominant here, but the cadential 6-4, the tonic 6-4 dominant that we end up getting is in the key of D, not in the key of A like it was earlier. Here we go. Okay, and let's move on to the closing group. And that closing material, remember I divided it into 2 sections. The third theme, yum dum dum, jump dum dum, dum dum da, yum dum dum. It's embellishment, jabba dabba dum, jump dum 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 jump, and then that little 2-measure codetta. And that's the end of the recapitulation. So you can see the symmetry here, how the exposition and recapitulation bear so much resemblance to one another, and the development adds that needed tension in the middle. So if you were to think of the theme groups as characters, you could say that they're presented or they're exposed or they're shared with the audience, then the drama happens in the middle, and then there's a winding down. In drama you might call it a denouement, but a resolution of some sort, because now instead of the first and theme group being in 2 different keys, they're now in the same key. Maybe the first theme group is our male lead, and our second theme group is our female lead, and it's a romance, and there's a little turbulence here in the middle, but they end up in the same in the same key. They get married or whatever, they live happily ever after. There's definitely a dramatic element to this. So some questions I'd like to leave any of you viewing this presentation. Some questions to ponder are, what are the compositional advantages of using Sonata Allegro form? Why is it still being used today and adapted by composers? Maybe the Sonata Allegro form, as we've looked at it with a movement from tonic to dominant, isn't part of today's Sonata Allegro forms, but the idea that there's an exposing of themes, related themes or contrasting themes, themes in different key areas, or at least something different. Maybe the principal theme is in the key of, or on a tonal center of C, and its partner, the secondary theme, is a tritone axis away in F sharp, or maybe a half step above in D flat. There might be some variation of it, but then there'd be a development section where all sorts of manipulations of that theme would happen, and then a return, so this larger ABA form. So what is the advantage of that? And what are some analysis strategies for spotting and tracking sonata allegro form in these traditional form, or even if you were to go see a piece performed by an orchestra that you understood possibly with sonata allegro form by one of today's composers? What would be some strategies as you either look at the score or as you listen to it being performed to track or confirm if sonata allegro form was at work?